We're now going to take questions of our panelists, but we can do better than that. Give our three panelists.
Thank you. Thank you.
There's a question.
My name is Ashok, and I'm with an organization called Metaculture, and we have an initiative called Citizen Demos that is
Ashok with
Better culture.
better.
Does this make a difference? Yeah. Okay, wonderful. So Citizen Demos is an initiative to try and strengthen the values and culture of democracy, and I'm extraordinarily happy to be here and to speak and to listen to you folks. So one question that keeps coming up, Mr. Dictor, am I saying your name right? Yes. You touched on it about scaling up. And I was very impressed with Maharaj's points about the values and the heart and mind of citizens. And so my question is really this. How do you get ordinary, extraordinarily overextended citizens to commit any time at all outside of their professional lives, outside of their personal lives, outside of their amusements and entertainments and therapy sessions and everything else? How can we get the ordinary citizens who are the only people who can sustain a democracy because by creating a very robust culture of democracy, how do we get them to even spend 1 hour a week? Is that too optimistic? Because I've been trying to do this for about 20 years, and I have to say it's sometimes extremely depressing to watch people sit around with beer and coffee and trash the leaders of their own countries, but not invest even 20 minutes of any kind of action or deliberation on their own democratic society. So I would love to swap notes, and because I personally find that there are enough ideas, but we're not putting enough feet on the ground. Thank you.
You relate to this?
Yes.
Okay. Ashok, I share your concern and pain sometime when you come at 8 p.m. in the evening and 1 or 2 came because you asked them to come personally and you expect the others, and slowly by 9 p.m. about a dozen of them gather, and you know that everybody has put their children to sleep already and no one more will come. I know this feeling, and we share it sometime. But one very, very interesting project that we started 2 years ago is workshops on telling the story. It corresponds with your creating the norm and telling the story also. We found this extremely effective. When our core staff, I think we ran this workshop here too, right, Joanna? Just recently. It's so effective when our staff and our core activists everywhere, when they practice, I don't want to say they know already, but they practice how to tell the story, how to tell our story, how to help the activists tell their story, the widening circles. This attracts more and more people. I can only tell you that 2 weeks ago we have opened another textbook in Wadi Ara, which is a combined, mainly Arab populated area with less Jews in it. It's where I live, by the way. we opened the textbook for the third year. In the first year, only 7 people participated. In the second year, last year, between 10 and 13. This year already, after this telling the story workshops, 64 people showed up to the first session. We don't have enough instructors for such numbers, but we recruited immediately for the second meeting. What I'm saying is much patience, much ability to absorb disappointments. Not everybody's sharing this. Every activist in the world is sharing this. Knowing that the goal of creating a shared, inclusive civil society in this racist world is worthy cause for any effort invested. This is my answer to you. All right?
You want to talk about the moment?
Oh, nothing on that paper.
Okay.
That's good, yeah.
My name is Zach. My question is to Tatiana. Taking your lessons from Bulgaria, let's say we fast forward about 50 years, how would you teach about the current atmosphere in U.S. history in schools?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
If we were to fast forward about 50 years and you're writing textbooks about the current U.S. administration and current U.S. history, how would you go about doing that based off of some of the lessons you've had from Bulgaria?
How do we describe I didn't understand, I'm sorry.
Give me a second, I can think of a better way.
How do we...
How would you recommend, how would you teach about
How would
U.S.
I-
history?
How
How
would
would I
you tell
recommend
the story about America?
About America, America is the second missing from the textbooks in Bulgaria. But the question is that we have a huge. Okay, let me give you just an example. The day when Donald Trump was elected President of the United States, I was in a tramway in Sofia, the capital. I saw several girls and boys wearing the uniform from one of the elite schools, high schools in Sofia, in Bulgaria. And they were discussing this election. So one of the girls said, they elected Trump. It's great. Do you think so? Another girl said, no, I don't like his hair. And one boy answered, but the hair, this is not the way we are measuring a president. Whether will he be a good president? And I say he will be a good president because do you know how rich he is? So this is not representative, of course, of the way the whole teenagers in Bulgaria think about the American elections, but this is a good example, I think, of the way the school is totally missing from the contemporary world for those high schoolers, I mean. This is the example of the lack of civic education. And when I speak about civic education, I bear in mind what was said in the first panel when you discussed Albania, the Albanian example. I just recollect that, so to remind you that several NGOs in Albania were afraid to say that they were trade unionists because in Albania that would mean that they are communist. In Bulgaria, the same thing, so the same problem with using words but giving them a different connotation. with the word civic education, because civic education was something that communists called a civic education when they were brainwashing us. And so today, if you say we need a civic education at school, the answer is, are you communist? Well, I'm not. That's the problem. I'm not. And so how would I explain what happened in America to Bulgarians in schools today, if this is the question and if I understand it correctly? I would start from the civic education, not with the examples of the present day America.
It's too far. No ground.
No.
Guy in the back, and then I'll come up front.
Hi, Richard Collenberg with the Century Foundation. I was very interested in the example in Israel of schools that are bringing together children of different backgrounds. In this country, we have a long history of segregated schools, and I've been researching and writing about the idea of bringing students of different economic backgrounds together, in part because that translates into racial diversity. And the argument has primarily been about academic achievement, but I think you're absolutely right. It's now, with our crisis in democracy, we have to think about this in terms of our democratic institutions. It's obviously much easier for a demagogue to run and demonize other people when the schools are segregated. My question is a practical one. In this country, when we try to integrate schools, you need some sort of sweetener. You need some, either a special teaching approach or a special theme. We call them magnet schools here. And I'm wondering, in Israel, are you getting people to come together just because they think this is the right thing to do for their kids? Or is the language something that's attractive, that they're going to be clearly getting a good education in two languages? Or are there other tactics that you use to encourage people to buy into integrated schools?
It's a very good question. This is true. Parents are sending their children to a bilingual school not only because it is bilingual. There must be another magnet. And our team is working on it all the time, and every school, every bilingual school has a different magnet, so to speak. 2 years ago, we have sent all our school principals to America at the invitation of American Federation of Teachers. And they visited schools in Austin, Texas, all week just in Austin to learn about bilingualism and about special ways that the staff of AFT have shown them. It was wonderful, and they came back with new methods. I can tell you that since then, after implementing some of that stuff, more enrollment came in to at least 2 of our schools. Yes, you're right, there's a need for more than just the political statement. You need to be good. So disappointing.
The gentleman here. You need the mic.
Yes, my name's Norman Birnbaum. I'm a retired professor from Georgetown Law across the street, so a neighbor friendly neighbor, I hope to say, of the AFT. I've got a question for Rob Goodman. You're teaching not only very good students at Columbia, obviously, but future members of whatever passes for our elite. How would you describe their civic attitudes? That is, how many of them, how have they reacted to the advent of our new president? How do they see themselves as civic actors as opposed to pursuing their own careers, if you can make that difference.
Oh boy, I suppose this has to be off the record. I don't want to get in trouble in my student evaluations. I'll keep this off the record. But I will say a few things. I think it's true that this is that millennials, and I suppose I could even myself be an older millennial, are an especially politically engaged generation, and I think that's great. I think if there's a downside about teaching at a fairly elite place like Columbia, the students are all, of course, smart, well-read, they're well-spoken, they can present their ideas very well. Oh, but to get there, you've had to have jumped through so many hoops in your academic career to that point. And my worry is that to get to the point where you're undergrad at a selective institution like that, you have to be very good at playing games, and you have to be very good at understanding what people in authority want and giving it to them, which means that they write very good papers and they have very good things to contribute in class. But it also means that from what I hear about how students were, generations ago, and who knows, maybe this is the grass is always greener syndrome, but my perception is that they're not quite as ornery as they might have been a couple of generations ago. I don't know if that's the case. I've only have a few years of experience under my belt, but I think that's part of the nature of what happens when the economic stakes in this country are so high. And by the way, I mean, this process starts with 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds. My wife worked as a nanny in New York, and she could tell you all about the standardized tests they give to 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds that start their career in elite education. The kids themselves are smart, well-spoken, engaged. I don't have a single bad thing to say about them. I think the problem is that with the stakes so high, the rewards so rich for doing well, and the cliff so sharp if you happen to fall off at some point in your life, it puts a tremendous amount of pressure on people in the education system.
That's true. That's true and painful.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Louis Malfaro from the Texas American Federation of Teachers. So I found Tatiana's critique of the education system and really laying the blame for a failure for democracy to ignite fascinating. And we're here at the Shanker Institute, and Albert Shanker led a union that prided itself on being about democracy for education and education for democracy. And there's a deep belief that it's impossible to have a successful democracy without an educated populace. And so I'm curious to know from Professor Robb and from Shuli and even from Dr. Kallenberg whether we've failed and whether our systems of education are indeed much to blame for having an electorate that isn't willing to participate in the democratic process because it fundamentally doesn't understand its role. And I would just share a very brief anecdote. When I was in junior high school, my school did a month-long project on advertising, and we studied as a whole school how advertising worked from top to bottom, the different techniques that were used, the ways that advertisers tried to convince you to buy their products, and it made me a lifelong skeptic and a great lover of non-commercial television and radio, because I can't listen to an advertisement and not dissect the game that it is playing or trying to play with me. And I wonder, are we teaching enough of our populace to think that way about their role in participatory democracy and being cagey enough, especially in this time of digital communication, to be good consumers of information?
Yeah, I could say something to that very briefly. I took a unit like that myself, I think, when I was sometime in elementary school, about all the techniques they use on you in advertising, and it stuck with me in a similar way. I don't know if I can speak more broadly to how people get civic education in the education system from elementary school up. But I could say, as someone who works on political theory, one of the things that's so valuable about teaching the long history of political thought in the West, the canon, which I think you have to put in quotes, is that a lot of it is written by people who aren't Democrats. Political philosophy and political theory are invented in a way to criticize democracy, and it's not until very recently in the history of that you have people speaking for marginalized groups, that you have people speaking about the wisdom of the masses and the value of mass participation. But that doesn't mean that tradition is bad and not worth teaching. It means it's something to push off against, because those ideas never really go away. It seems part of the problem in this particular political moment of crisis is that when someone makes an anti-democratic argument, or when someone makes an argument for exclusion, or when someone makes a tribalistic or sort of race-baiting argument, it just seems that good liberals like myself, sometimes we're stunned and we don't know what to say, and we couldn't imagine that someone would think like that. But I have a feeling that if we do more to study our history of political thought, that we can very well imagine that people can think like that, why they think like that, and maybe what to say about them. I start at Columbia in the core curriculum, we start our students off on Plato, who's one of history's great critics of democracy. Good, we ought to understand where he's coming from, and if we think he's wrong, we ought to understand why he's wrong, and I think that'll make us better equipped in a way. That's just speaking to the higher education end of it. I'm sure there's a lot more to be said about how you bring people up to the point where they can engage like that in elementary and secondary school, but I think learning that tradition, even the ugly parts of it, is so important.
My name is Ted Kirsch. I am the AFT Vice President, and I don't have a question, I have an observation. I am fortunate to be one of a number of people from AFT who visited Hand in Hand School. And I saw through the vision of a teacher. And you said something about the adults. The thought that has stayed with me since I visited your school in Jerusalem was the kids. Looking at kids interacting, you did not see Palestinian kids. You didn't see Jewish kids. You saw kids. And the interaction that I observed has stayed with me, so that I don't think that it's the adults that have to make this change, as you indicated. I don't want to misquote you. But to me, my thought was, it's the kids that's going to change the society because of schools like Hand in Hand. And I congratulate you on all of your efforts.
This is going to end our session. I want to thank our panelists again. But I think this conversation has to continue. It is, I hear that the youth is going to change, but if the youth don't know our history, they won't make a change. Thank you.